Welcome everyone to the seventh installation of MarshWatch. Today is going to be bird heavy indeed. We don't have any amphibians to go over, but we do have a few kind of a tougher look-alike species. So we're going to be spending a lot of time with a couple of these birds here. So just so you know what's coming up. Um, I'm broadcasting today from the lovely city of Saskatoon, which is located on Treaty 6 territory, encompassing the traditional lands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis people. It is a lovely city. If you've never been, highly recommend coming for a visit at some point here. My name is Leanne Latrimoy, and I have been doing bird work and wetland work for quite a number of years now. I started in 2008, and I really do love wetlands, and moving out to the prairies for someone who loves wetlands is just it's so wonderful because we have such an immense diversity of waterfowl species and waterfowl species, like in abundance, as well as all kinds of wetlands just strewn across the landscape. So I'm super fortunate to, work for an organization like Birds Canada and, to do so in some of my favorite habitats. Birds Canada is a not-for-profit organization. Our mission is to drive action to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada. Today, we're just going to be doing birds, so I'll record that and post it online, and then we'll have our usual quizzes, discussions, and chit-chat at the end. Our birds today, as I mentioned, we have a few look-alike species. So we've got the two wrens that like to hang out in wetlands. We've got Marsh Wren and Sedge Wren. We've got the common yellowthroat, which is a warbler that you'll often find in wetland environments, as well as the northern harrier, which is a raptor, and two very similar looking terns, the common and Forster's terns, as well as two very loud, very chatty shorebirds, the Willet and the marbled Godwit. So let's dive right in with our first set of species. So these are two small, little, very, very active birds. We've got the marsh wren and the sedge wren. They both like wetland environments, and although one is called a marsh wren and one is called a sedge wren, that might lead you to think, okay, maybe the marsh wren occurs in deeper wetlands, the sedge wren in shallower wetlands, and you're mostly right. But because water depth is, kind of a fluid thing in a wetland, even within a season, and that doesn't always hold true for the names of these birds where the habitats are. So you can't just say it's a marsh wren because it's in cattails and bulrushes. Likewise, you can't just call it a sedge wren because it's in a drier part of a wetland. So just want to get that out of the way. It can be useful to remember some of their habitat preferences, but it is by no means a hard and fast rule because birds are really mobile and they're quite responsive to changes in their environment. And so birds like these that like these kind of shallow wetland environments, they often don't even come back to the same patch of landscape because evolutionarily that doesn't necessarily make sense. All of these shallow wetlands, can change from one season to another. And so most of these wetland species in general just don't come back to those same locations. Okay. Wrens overall are very, very small, active little birds. They have a stiff kind of tail, and you can think about them a bit like the reddy ducks that hold their tails up. They do like to hold their tail up to some degree, and they're little kind of gymnasts. They clamber around the wetland vegetation, and they are just outrageously active. They are singing their little hearts out so much of the day, so much of the night. There's only a few times where they actually quiet down, and it happens to be just after sunset. They're a little bit quieter in the middle of the day, but man, from kind of sunset evening periods throughout the night and into the morning, if you have either of these species on your wetland, you are definitely going to hear them. So let's take a look at the marsh wren first. Small little wren, compact overall. It's got like a relatively long bill for its body size, and that's kind of useful if you're comparing to the sedge wren. But both sexes of both of these species look the same, and in the marsh wren, there is more of a rusty brown color overall. There's barring on the tails and the wings, and one of the keys if you're seeing this bird, which oftentimes you don't. They're really small and they can sing from like right within the cattail. So sometimes you're just, doing this by ear. But if you do get the chance to see them, one of the things that stands out about the marsh wren is this bold eyebrow. It contrasts with the markings on the rest of the face. So the cap is dark, the rest of, the markings on the face or the coloration there is a little bit darker. So that white stands out and it has that contrast. And just that difference in intensity of the lightness or the darkness really makes it stand out. They also have kind of a nice little palish throat. And the other thing that always grabs my attention is while there's barring on the back and the wings and the tail, this patch right here, kind of the upper coverts, is just plain brown. So it kind of just makes a rusty brownish patch on the wings. But for me, again, usually you're doing this by ear or you're catching a glimpse of that kind of high contrast eyebrow stripe. Very, very handsome little birds. And like I said, super, super active. They glean vegetation, they glean their prey off of the vegetation. So they're after all kinds of little insects. So insects, aquatic insects, so, things that are just below the water surface, they can scamper down and pick things off as they're, as they catch them near the surface. And they'll eat things like spiders as well. So they're going around and they're just picking mostly insect material. They don't really eat a lot of plants. They don't do seeds so much. You'll find marsh wrens in wetlands that usually have cattails and bulrushes, so you'll usually see them in wetlands that are fairly deep. So usually it's going to have a bit of open water in it. It's going to have some of those deeper wetland species. But again, that can change during the season, and a wetland can dry out and the marsh wrens can still be hanging out there. So, use as a bit of a clue, but not your only diagnostic. What's cool about marsh wrens is that they make these little globe-shaped nests, and it's essentially like a ball of rushes and cattails. And we're not really sure why, but males will build multiple nests in their territory, and usually only one is occupied. And so we're not sure if it's, they're building decoy nests, say for predators. Predator keeps going into all of these nests and never finds anything. It might just give up and like stop trying to get food out of all of these empty nests. So it could be that. It could be to signal to females just like, hey, I'm the busiest guy in town. And they really are busy. They really don't ever stop moving, singing, doing something. They're just amazingly busy little birds, which is why it's hard to get a good look at them for the most part, because if you do see them, it's kind of like a warbler. They're always active, and they're only still for a couple of seconds. If you get them singing, you got a bit of a chance, but otherwise they're just bouncing around so quickly. So, oops, I hit that scroll button again. Okay. So marsh wrens have a kind of variable gurgling rattle, and it does sound similar to the sedge wren. And don't worry, we're going to compare and contrast them side by side, but let's just listen to that kind of variable gurgling rattle of the marsh wren. So it's not totally consistent from one bout of song to the other, even within the same individual. Oh, the audio is not playing for you. Oh, thank you so much. Okay, I do not have the sound on. Hang on 1 second. Share settings. Do, 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 do. Okay, I think we're just going to have to unshare and reshare. Oh, there we go. Share sync, optimize for video. Okay, I'll do that again. Let's hear it now. Let me know if you can hear it in the comments. Awesome. So it's kind of a squeaky, gurgly rattle thing, and oftentimes it sounds like there's a tiny buzz at the front end, or it sounds like they're taking in a little bit of a breath and taking a breath and then doing that kind of gurgling rattle. And it really is variable, and I know it might not sound like it, but it has a bit more of a musical quality. And we'll see the sedge wren here in a second. That sounds much more like a sewing machine. So I'll play it one more time, and then we'll do some comparing in a second here. And it can be very tough to tell how many are singing if you have a whole bunch of them in an area. Sometimes they can be very loud, and they definitely overlap. Marsh wrens have a fairly wide distribution across North America. They are a North American species, and you don't have them absolutely everywhere, but enough places in North America. Okay, the sedge wren is kind of a little bit more plain compared to the marsh wren. This is a very small wren, a little bit smaller than the marsh wren. It has a shorter bill overall, but again, you're not likely to see something like that. Both sexes look the same, and instead of kind of a richer brown rusty color, they're more pale and a bit more straw colored. They're not as richly brown. And there's barring all over the place, all over the crown, on the back, on the entirety of the wings, on the tail. So remember how that marsh wren had that kind of rusty patch here on the upper wing? The Sedge Wren doesn't have that. Sedge Wren has all of these markings all over the place. And while there is a bit of an eye line, it doesn't stand out. It's not high contrast like it is in the marsh wren. So it's a bit more of a faint eyebrow looking thing. So shoulder patch, eyeliner. That's where you want to take a look at between the two wrens if you do happen to get a glimpse of them and they are close enough to see those details. That's the other thing. Sometimes you catch a glimpse of it, and because they're such small birds, half the time they're far enough away that you're like, ah, yes, small and brown, and that's all you kind of get out of your binoculars. Still cool to see them, and you can definitely see that kind of stiff tail posture that they often have, but sometimes, they'll still be too far away to tell those kind of more subtle details. And that also depends on the kind of optics you have. I know when I first started bird watching, I was a broke student. I didn't have a whole lot of money to spend on binoculars. My first binoculars were not the greatest, and that's okay. Um, for these guys, we can focus a lot more on the sound. So Sedge wrens, you do tend to find them in shallower areas of wetlands. So oftentimes where that kind of wetland will grade into, a bit more of that upland habitat, they're kind of in the in-between. So dense sedges and grasses on the margins of wetlands, wet meadows, sometimes in hay fields, but you'll also get them kind of creeping into some of those wetter cattail areas. So again, not a hard and fast rule. This is another one that eats much the same, but they tend to eat less aquatic insects because they tend to be found in areas with less standing water. So they're going after insects and spiders for the most part. And very similar to the marsh wren, they build these globe-shaped nests, and they do also build multiples of them. The sedge wren's call is much kind of harsher, and to me, it always reminds me of something like a sewing machine. And there's a couple of intro notes, and when you're starting to get that sewing machine going, it kind of clunk, 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 and then it gets going. That's kind of like the Sedge Wren's call. So it has a few intro notes and then a kind of harsh machine-like rattle. And it's very consistent between calls of the same individual. The marsh wren varies the notes that it sings in that kind of bout of song. It'll kind of do like one type of note and then take a pause and then do another rattle of another type of note. The sedge wren doesn't really have that variation. You got a couple of intro notes and that kind of harsh machine-like rattle. Let's play it again. So for me, I always kind of catch those intro notes. And sometimes that sort of thing takes a while for your ear to pick up. But those intro notes that click, click, that click, click, click ahead of it, for me, really stands out. The sedge wren doesn't have quite as broad a distribution, but you're still fairly likely to see them, across a fair bit of the Great Plains. There's going to be less of them into Alberta. And again, range maps are, kind of just a suggestion. Anything along the boundaries is totally up for, change and debate because the birds are not following any sort of map. They're just going where they like to be. So remember that these range maps are just kind of a useful guide. They're not the be all end all. So taking a look at those two wrens side by side, the marsh wren, we have that bold white eyebrow that really contrasts strongly with the rest of the face. It's got a nice dark cap, darker patch kind of near the eye, so that white really stands out. The sedge wren, on the other hand, overall just kind of brown and streaky. and it's got a weak eyebrow and it doesn't contrast very strongly with anything going on the face. You wouldn't look at that and say, oh, it's got a nice eyebrow stripe, whereas you might say that for the marsh wren. It's got this white eyebrow stripe. Again, taking a look at the wings on the marsh wren, there is that patch of feathers that is just plain brown. It's a very warm brown overall. On the sedge wren, it's much more extensive barring, and there isn't that kind of plain patch on the shoulder. And that just happens to be if you're lucky enough to see them for long enough to actually get any information out of what you're seeing. Marsh wrens tend to favor deeper marshes, sedge wrens tend to favor kind of the more shallow areas of the wetland, and you can absolutely have them in the same wetland, and the edges kind of blur as to where one or the other can be. So keep that in mind. All right, listen to it once more side by side. We've got the gurgling rattle of the marsh wren here. So much squeakier, a lot of kind of different qualities to the different notes, whereas the sedge wren is really machine-like in its rattle with those intro notes. And this is one, like, personally, it took me a long time to just get those sounds sounding different in my own brain. And, if you're hearing these right now and you're going, gosh, Leanne, those sound the same, don't worry about it. It's the sort of thing that will come with practice, and you'll be out there and you'll be hearing some of these things. And, these days with the Merlin app is getting much better. And so, if you are out by a wetland, let it run and see if you can hear the things that it is pointing out. That can be a really, really useful learning tool. It would have made my learning a whole lot easier if we had the technology back when I was trying to figure out bird calls with like going out and listening and then going back to the car and playing it on the CD. It was just not as easy as it is now. Okay. I've shown you guys a little bit of spectrograms before, but for anyone who hasn't seen these, a spectrogram is a way that we commonly use to visualize bird songs and calls. So a recording would typically, go from left to right. So you'd have a little bar moving along. So the x-axis is essentially time. The y-axis is frequency. So higher pitch sounds are higher up on this little frame, and low pitch sounds are low to the bottom. And it can be a really, really helpful way to visualize sounds. And sometimes it makes it make more sense in your brain if you don't have a particularly musical ear and you find it hard to, oh, this call rises. Well, really? Does that call rise? Sometimes just seeing that can be really, really helpful. There's the Peterson, I'm looking around because I'm not sure if I have it with me right here. It's probably in the other room. The Peterson Guide to Bird Songs is really, really useful. And probably the most useful thing about it is that there is a whole online compendium of these. I'll make a note to send it out in the next email, but you can see all of the different spectrograms and you can look up each species and just take a look at what their calls actually look like. So if you find this sort of a visualization useful, cool. If it makes no sense to you, don't worry about it. So here we're just visualizing the marsh wren and the sedge wren. So the marsh wren kind of has that buzz or that kind of inhale, and then those kind of rattly notes. And you can see the shape. So this one here and this one here are the same individual. And you can see the shape of those lines does look slightly different. And same with this one right here and this one, they're a little bit farther away, so they're paler. The intensity is shown by how yellow or pinkish it looks. And you can just see that as the bird is making different calls, it's changing it up ever so slightly. That's probably to say, hey ladies, listen to my repertoire. Some birds do that, some species don't. The sedge wren down here, you can clearly see those introductory notes, and then you got that kind of harsh staccato rattle. And here it is calling again, those intro notes, and then that harsh kind of staccato mechanical rattle. So, and the next slide here, we'll just go through some of those. So this is what the spectrogram looks like for a marsh wren call, and a marsh wren is calling here, here. There's at least 3 individuals. This would be one individual. This would be the same one. This would be the same one. this, and one of these is likely the same. If I had to make a guess, I would say that this would be probably the third. Listen to it, it might be the same one, but when you're listening to a spectrogram like this, you have the recorded in stereo, so you're putting headphones on, and you can hear the birds around you. Some of them sound further, some of them sound closer, some more to the left, some more to the right. So it's a really, really useful way, and this is how we process audio recordings that we make for sampling. Okay, here is the Marsh Wren. So that's probably not coming through super loud. It's not coming out super loud for me, but if you go back and listen to the recording once I post it online, you can probably boost up the sound on your end. And over-ear headphones really do wonders for listening to this type of recording track. But we can hear that kind of little inhale or a little buzz, and it makes that kind of gurgly variable rattle. Whereas in the next one here, we'll take a look at the Sedge Wren. I'll just pause that here. And you can see and hopefully hear those introductory notes and then that rattle. So intro notes and that kind of harsh staccato rattle. And I'm just seeing Mary's mentioning last year, I mentioned it sounded like Alvin the Chipmunk on helium or rewinding a cassette. And yeah, that Marsh Wren does sound a little bit funky like that. And I'm glad you remembered that because I don't remember saying it. So those are those two wrens side by side. And hopefully I've demystified them a little bit for you. But even if you're at the point where you're just like, it's one of the wrens, you're still doing a great job. Okay. We'll have a little palate cleanser, a little bit easier one here for you. So this is the common yellowthroat, and this is a species of warbler that, unlike a lot of other warblers that tends to enjoy, trees more so than, small shrubbies, the common yellowthroat is a wetland species. They also like, if you're out on a large pasture where there's some snowberry, you'll find them there as well, away from water. And I always associated them with just to be wetland species. But going out on some of those large pastures, you do see them out in the snowberry areas. And what those things have in common is that they're really dense, low to the ground, kind of structured habitats. So I think that's more what they're after than, say, the common yellowthroat loves wetlands. It just happens to be there because it's the right habitat structure. Okay, so the common yellowthroat is a small warbler. Males and females do look different. Warblers tend to have, small pointed little bills, and they're very, very active, but especially the yellowthroat, I find they can be somewhat secretive. The males, you tend to have a bit of better luck seeing them because they tend to perch up high and sing a few times, and then maybe they'll head off. The females are much more difficult to see, again, because they don't want to necessarily advertise where they're at. So let's take a look at the males first. They have this really adorable black bandit mask that is kind of edged in white over the top of the mask. And then they have that beautiful, just kind of lemon yellow throat that kind of fades into their chest and into their belly. On their back, they're kind of dull olivey brown color with hints of yellow on them, but that really dark mask that contrasts with the bright yellow throat and some of that white around the top part of the mask, just you're not going to confuse it with anything. So, common yellow throat, nice little bandit mask, and that nice, beautiful yellow throat. And they tend to sing versions of witchity, 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 or witchity, witchity, witch. And oftentimes it's kind of like 3 to 4 witchies in their song. And for whatever reason, for me personally, this is a bird that my brain tends to tune out. And then somebody points it out that it's been going for, several minutes and go, oh, there it is. So just keep that in mind. Sometimes your brain, the way it processes information, for whatever reason, for me, I filter out the common yellowthroat. So here it is. We won't be filtering it out now because we'll be listening to it loud and clear. All right, here we go. So a couple of those witchetty, witchetty, witcheties. Listen to that again. So handsome little bird, cute little song. The females, on the other hand, are rather plain looking, and on migration, man, they drive me nuts because they look like a few other species. But if you're seeing them in the springtime in the wetland, if you're lucky enough to get a look, they're a small yellowish looking warbler. They do have that throat that kind of harkens back to the male's bright yellow throat, and in some of them, it's a bit more, you know, pale yellowish, and some it's a little bit more vibrant. So it's kind of variable, the amount of yellow on the throat. The thing to pay attention to here is that there's a faint I-ring, but overall it's a very plain looking warbler. The wings are plain. There's no, markings, so to speak. There's no wing bars. There's no, little markings on them at all. Belly is also quite plain. The throat does contrast with the darker face, so no matter how much yellow it has, it does contrast with what else is going on the face. And so you can hopefully link that back to the yellow throat of the male. So faint eye-ring, otherwise rather plain, very, very secretive. They're not, it's not that they're not unattractive or anything, but but it does make them trickier, and they blend in really well to the vegetation in, those kind of wetland environments, especially if they're, bouncing around. It's a little bit dim under the canopy there, so hard to get a really nice look at, and even harder to take a good photo. It's always the hardest one to take photos of when I'm trying to, or to get photos for when I'm doing a presentation like this. So just keep that in mind. You're less likely to see the females, because they're quiet, they're secretive, but they're very, very handsome. This is a bird like all the other warblers. They glean prey off of vegetation and off of the ground. And like our Marsh Wren friends, they're going to be after insects and spiders. So they do like that dense, low vegetation, primarily wetlands, and in moist grassland and coulees where there's some of that kind of shrubby snowberry type thing. So handsome little bird with a really broad distribution across North America. Kind of no matter where you're at, you have a chance of running into the common yellowthroat. So that's always nice. I always like when, more people can take part in seeing these handsome, cute little guys. Okay. We are going to cover now the northern harrier, and this is one of the raptors that you'll actually see out in wetland environments. You'll also see them in kind of wet field areas. It's a medium-sized raptor. It's not huge, but it's not small like some of the smaller falcons that we have. The bird is overall fairly slender. They have long wings and a long tail. Both sexes have a facial disc, much like owls do, and males and females are different colored than one another. However, they do show this white rump patch, and we've been over this lots with all of the waterfowl. White really stands out at a distance, and the northern harriers, at the kind of where the tail meets the rest of the body, they have this white rump patch. And you might be thinking, gosh, Liam, when do you see the top side of a raptor as it's flying around? Well, you actually do on the northern harrier. They tend to fly really low over the landscape, and they just kind of cruise, and they tilt back and forth. And so this is a raptor that you actually do see the top of them, their back area, fairly regularly as they're flying around, because they do all of these banking moves. And I can usually just see how this raptor is flying, and I can know it's like, oh yeah, there's nothing else that's going to be cruising around like that. That's a northern harrier, especially if there's kind of dips in the landscape. You'll just see the harrier fly in, and it'll dip down and bank over. So that white rump patch, you see it in both of the sexes, and it is really, really useful. That's the thing that I clue in on first. It's the flight pattern, and then I'm looking for that white rump patch. The males are pale, kind of blue-gray overall. They have a whitish underwing with dark wingtips and kind of dark trailing edges of those flight feathers down there. So the males are they're quite striking. I really love the kind of pale blue grayish look to them. This isn't a raptor that I think I've ever actually heard. I'll play the call, but just know that it's more for interest's sake. This isn't something that you're gonna hear and go, ah, yes, the call of the Northern Harrier. I don't think I've ever heard them make noise myself. So they might do that if you happen to be close to their nest or something, but otherwise, mostly a silent bird. Let's take a look at the female here. She's very similar, same kind of deal. She's also got a facial disc, and again, you can see that lovely white rump patch over and above the tail. But overall, she looks really different. You might not even think that they're the same species, seeing just how different the female is. She's rich, warm browns above, heavily barred, seen from below, there's a lot of barring on the wings, but again, that white rump patch is the thing that really stands out, along with that kind of flight behavior. They just cruise low over those wetlands and fields. These guys actually nest on the ground in grassy areas and wetlands. And I've actually come across a northern harrier nest before, and they really were just on the ground, surrounded by some cattails in an area of a wetland that had been probably dry for a couple of years, but there was still some cattails hanging on. But yeah, just couple of young harriers just right there on a nest, right on the ground. So neat species. They're going to be going after, small prey, so mice and voles and things like that. I'm sure they would snatch up, fledgling birds if they could get them, but I suspect that they're probably more after things like, small mammals. But handsome little birds. Again, that white rump patch, long wings, slow cruise. They're just a treat to watch. It's really amazing because they do fly in some cases like just so close to the ground level. So neat, neat behaviors. Another really widespread species. You're likely to see northern harriers in all kinds of places across North America. So that's always fun. Okay, now we're going to get into the trickiest part of the evening. We're going to cover some terns. We did talk about the black tern already, and the black tern is quite different than the two that we'll cover tonight, which are the common and Forster's terns. The black tern has a nice jet black body and silvery wings, but the other two terns are very similar looking. And terns in general, they're related to gulls, but they're kind of like the sleeker, sexier cousin of the gulls. They have nice pointed bills, fine wings with pointed wingtips. They just look sleeker and nicer. So we're going to take a look at the common and Forster's terns, but just I want to preface this by saying you don't always get a good enough look at these birds to be able to identify them down to species. There are plenty of these terns that I have seen that they're just moving past too quickly. You don't get the look you need. And it's like, well, it's one of the two terns because those are the two in that size category that we have here. So if they look very similar, it's because they are. And, try not to get frustrated if you're out there birding because, like I said, not every single individual is going to be identifiable. You don't always get enough of a look at them or the look that you need. They're always giving you like the wrong angles sometimes. So, and they're very fast. So I just drive that point home. This little Office Space meme here where corporate's needing you to find the differences between the two pictures, and she's saying that they're the same. So it really is a bit of a spot the difference exercise, and it is one of the more challenging IDs in terms of wetland birds for sure. We'll do a lot of compare and contrast, but the first two slides we'll just talk about the common tern, and then we'll talk about the Forster's tern, and then we'll compare side by side lots. So medium-sized whitish tern, slender wings, and a nice forked tail. Both sexes look the same, and the bill is reddish with a dark tip, but it's really hard to tell if it's kind of reddish or orange-ish at a distance. The Forester tern has a bit more of a orangey looking bill, but that is probably one of the, for me anyway, the least used field mark. What I really want to look for if I'm seeing the birds flying is taking a look at the upper part here and seeing, okay, does the upper back color match what's going on along the upper wing surface? So in the common tern, the common has continuous coloration from the upper back is kind of a darker gray than, say, the whitish underparts of the bird. So dark gray, and that dark kind of extends continuously down to the wingtip. So common continuous is what we landed on last time when we gave this. You'll sometimes see a variable dark wedge in the primaries, but depending on the molt and the plumage, that's not always visible. They do have a very subtle gray belly, and that really, for the most part, looks like shadow, and it can be totally obscured by any sort of shadow. So they do have a gray belly, but it can be really subtle, hard to see. Sometimes that's something that's more useful in, say, like a well-lit photograph like this. If you happen to be a bird photographer, then maybe you get a shot and you can see, oh yeah, I can tell that, it's whiter up near this cheek here and grayer down by the belly. The tail also shows dark on the outer side of the feathers, but again, that's something else that is quite hard to see for the most part. If they're flying, I'm looking for the upper back being the same color as the rest of the wing. You'll find common terns in a variety of habitats that have water bodies for fishing, and common terns actually nest on the ground, so they'll nest in kind of rocky or pebbly shores. Forster's tern looks quite similar. So that bill tends to be a bit more orange with a dark tip, but lighting can throw that off. That kind of orange to red can be so similar, especially, in evening or morning light, that again, it's very much a secondary characteristic. For the back coloration fades into white onto the wingtip. So you can see it here in this photo, those kind of dark feathers on the back fading into a kind of whitish wingtip. So that's what I'm looking at when I'm seeing these two birds, the common continuous or the Forster fade. Forster's has a white belly, but again, if you happen to catch it and there's a bit of a shadow based on where the sun is, it can also look like it has a gray belly just because that's what a shadow looks like on white. And I'll show you the tail feather comparison in a couple of slides here. Forster's terns, they breed in wetlands and they nest on floating vegetation or even on muskrat lodges, which I've seen. I have seen a Forster's tern nest on a muskrat lodge. It was pretty neat to actually see. I don't think I took a picture, but I should have. Anyway, so that's the Forster's tern. And again, the two are super, super similar, and it is more than okay to say it's one of the two. It's a common or Forster's tern. I don't know. I'm not, maybe you just haven't worked up to that level yet. This is birding on hard mode for sure. So here's another nice shot of that kind of Forster's fade where you can see that dark coloration on the back doesn't continue. It fades into a white. And side by side here, the common continuous and the Forster's fade. Really, that for me, when they're flying around, that's the part that I'm looking for. It's actually even easier if you happen to see the birds perched. And those differences in the way the wingtips are colored actually shows up while the bird has its wings folded up. So the common tern's primary feathers, they actually wind up looking really dark gray as the bird has them folded up and kind of nestled into one another. And that contrasts with the rest of the feathers. So the wingtips are dark, or on the Foresters, you can see those kind of frosty colored silvery primaries, so they look silvery gray when those wings are folded up. And the wing tips in the common tern, the tail is shorter than the folded wing tips, so you'll be seeing the end of the tail down here, and this is where the wing tips extend back to. Or on the Forester's tern, the wing tips are shorter than the rest of the tailing. So you'll have that tail kind of hanging down well past the wing tips. So That's another clue, but if they're perched, I'm really looking for what do those primaries look like when they're all scrunched up next to one another compared to the coloration on the rest of the bird. So that to me is the most useful. Sometimes you will see them in a group, one next to the other, and if they are together, then some of those slight differences in, say, bill color, that's when those become a little bit more obvious, but it can be really hard to tell. I can't tell you how many Forster's terns I've agonized over when I was learning, going, is that reddish or is that kind of dark orange? Don't bother playing that game unless you have them side by side and you're really just kind of nerding out on the different bill colors. The legs are also slightly different when they're perched, and this again is really mostly only useful if you have a mixed flock of them together. If they're together, the common tern is going to look shorter. It's going to have shorter little legs, and the Forster's tern has slightly longer legs. But again, that's something that if you happen to have a whole bunch of terns all hanging out together on a roosting ground, that can be useful. They do make slightly different calls, and those calls can be hard to tell apart. For the common tern, it's more like a two-syllable key-er, where the Forester's tern, it's more one syllable that kind of fades. Key-er. But again, it's the sort of thing that's subtle and, you know, they don't always give you the ideal perfect calls either. So this can be another useful clue. So the two-parted key-er of the common tern here. Versus the kind of extended fading keer of the Forester's tern. So keer, keer, more monosyllabic, so one syllable. Oops, let's play that one again. Versus keer. Okay, so those two together, the common continuous and the Forester fade when we're looking at those wingtips. Common will have a bit of a gray belly, Foresters will have a white belly, and if you see them side by side, that bill color dark red on the common and more orangey on the Forester's tern. If you happen to be a photographer and you're snapping just a ton of photos, this can be useful to look at, but it is something that is really, really difficult to see, in person. We can look at the color of the outer tail feathers, so those really, really long ones. In the common terns, there's a dark on the outside edge of the feather, so the feathers are two-toned. And on the Foresters, those outside feathers, it's dark on the inner margin of those feathers. So again, that's sort of something that's more useful if you've taken a few photos of them and you go, ah, gosh, I can't really tell. Because even looking at this belly here, like all of that dark, all of that kind of grayish, that's just shadowing on the bird's belly. So that gray belly is kind of not the most useful clue. Looking at the wings, so the fades, and also looking at if they're perched, how those wingtips look like when the wing is folded, and how long the wingtips go, or how long the tail is compared to the length of the wingtips. And both of these species, they forage by plunging kind of straight down into the water. The black tern that we saw last time just kind of picks and gleans things off the water surface, whereas these two terns, they're going after small fish and they are diving headfirst into that water. And it is really, really cool to see. And they'll make lots of plunges into the water and they'll be able to come out and keep flying. And they do come up with a fish, find it kind of fairly routinely, but I always like cheering for them when they finally get one because sometimes it's like diving several times and coming up empty-handed, but I just always find it really exciting to see them actually come up with something. And they'll fly a long ways with that fish. They'll offer fish as nuptial gifts for their mates. They'll feed them while they're hanging out at the nest, and then they'll feed their young. So you can see some really neat food display behavior by these terns if you happen to be seeing an area where they're nesting. Okay. Common tern has a fairly wide distribution across North America, and it's another one with those Holarctic distributions. So you are likely to see common terns across much of the northern hemisphere. Forster's terns, on the other hand, they are a bit more range limited. We get them mainly kind of in Canada on the northern Great Plains. You do get a little bit of them in southern Ontario. And one summer when we were doing marsh bird surveys at Long Point, we actually found a Forster's tern colony. One of our survey stations happened to be this cattail island that was kind of off, in part of the lake. It was disconnected from the main cattail stand, and yeah, it was really fun doing a survey, pulling up a canoe next to this cattail island that just had these terns just screaming at you and dive bombing. It was very hard to count anything other than angry terns. There also wasn't a ton there because of the angry terns, but yeah. So likely to see them on the northern Great Plains and in a few scattered areas as well. Okay, next up, we have two loud, boisterous, noisy shorebirds. And first up, we've got the willet. This is a fairly large shorebird, so this isn't going to be one of those small ones you see on that kind of spring and fall migration. Willets are a fairly large bird. They've got a dark, straight bill. They've got long, dull gray legs, so they don't have any coloration going on in migration, and we'll cover them in the review. Yellow legs have bright yellow legs, but the willet is overall just extremely gray looking, gray bill, gray body coloration, gray legs, until it flashes its wings, and then you get this bold flash of black and white patterning on the wings, and it's really quite striking. But otherwise, it really does look kind of gray and unassuming overall. Both sexes look the same, and you'll find willets on the edges of wetlands and ponds. And the willets, along with the marbled godwit, they will actually nest in the upland habitat away from the wetland. So they'll be, up in some grassy areas. They'll have their young there, and then they'll walk them to the water's edge. So neat birds, but they're incredibly vocal. And if you are near an area that has a willet, you will know because they will essentially just start screaming at you. Very, very vocal. And they're one of the birds that says its name. So they say in some of their calls, Willet, Willet, Pill Will Willet, and variations on that theme. So let's play that here for you. And here's the Pill Will Willet, or the Willet. So first off, that Pill Will Willet. And just imagine that as you're doing wetland surveys and they're following you to the next pond and screaming at you. It's bringing back fond memories for me. So fairly unassuming bird, like I said, until they flash those wings that have that kind of, pardon me, like they have that bold black and white wing patterning. They will eat kind of anything that they can get their little bills on. They will walk steadily around and pick and swish and probe for food. And they'll kind of get anything they can eat. So insects, crustaceans, mollusks on the wintering grounds, they're eating polychaete worms in the ocean there. Small fish, amphibians like this poor little frog here. So they really will kind of eat anything that's about the right size for them. So very handsome little birds. Here's a juvenile here, still fluffy, still downy, but it's walking around. It doesn't quite have that long bill grown out yet, but it will get there. I always think it's funny when little birds that, as an adult, the species has a long bill, but they don't usually have that as they're hatched because that would be super inconvenient in, the egg. So they do grow out those bills as they're busy, growing out the rest of their bodies as well outside the egg. So I always think it's pretty cute when they look like the adult, but not quite, don't quite have a long enough bill. But very, very bold bird. Really, really quite common, especially, in wetlands on the northern Great Plains. There's also an eastern population of willets as well, and they're slightly different than the western willets, but essentially they do look really similar overall. And last but not least, we have the marbled godwit, where the willet was kind of pale, cool gray tones overall. The marbled godwit is more browns and cinnamon. This is another large shorebird. They're kind of similar in size. It has a long, slightly upturned bill, and the bill is two-toned. It's reddish near the base, and it kind of gets darker towards the tip. They have long, dark legs, and overall, just they're a large-bodied bird, much like the willet. Both sexes show mottled brown patterning and cinnamon tones. They have a dark cap, a little bit of a dark eye line going through. And if you do happen to see them in flight, they have cinnamon patches on the upper wing and on the under parts of their wings here. I love seeing these guys take off because that cinnamon is it's such a rich kind of reddish tone to them. So really, really gorgeous birds. Similar in habits to the willet, you're going to be seeing them on a lot of kind of small ponds. They do also nest in the upland area and take their kids down to the water. And it's sort of a namesay. It does say Godwit, Godwit. And this is another one that will see you coming, 200 yards or 200 meters away, and it will fly up and it will start just yelling at you, and it will circle around you, just saying like, hey, predator, predator, this warning everything in the neighborhood, and they will follow you from wetland to wetland basin. So here is the marbled godwit's very loud call. So you can imagine how hard it is to be counting all the other birds when you have this marbled godwit flying around you and screaming. So we'll hear it once more. So very loud, sort of a namesayer. This is another one that walks steadily and probes and picks for food. They really like grasshoppers. They'll also eat a little bit of aquatic plants, so they'll go after a few aquatic plant tubers. They also eat leeches and small fish. And here you can see some of those cinnamon patches on the wings as they're getting up and flying. So nice rusty reddish bird. Similar in sort of habits to the willet, but the willet is those cool gray tones overall, where the godwit is more warm brown cinnamon tones. And again, that bill is bicolored and just slightly upturned. And it really is, it's kind of ridiculously long. You'll find these guys in areas with a mix of native prairie and wetlands of different types. So some deeper basins, some shallower basins, but they do like to go around and pick on the water's edge. So they do like to have something that has a little bit of, either if not a shoreline, then a shallows area that they can walk around in. This one has an interesting distribution. The large part of the population is found really in the northern Great Plains area, but there is also a small population in Alaska and a small population, on the James Bay coast here. So small, disjunct population, so kind of interesting, but again, the bulk of the population is here on the Canadian prairies and in some of the northern US states. So really neat little distribution there. And woohoo, we're almost through. So comparing those two side by side, again, the marbled godwit has a longer bicolored upturned bill, and the willet really just has that kind of gray. It's still long, but it's not super, super long. So straight, darker bill. And overall, the differences in colors, the willet is those cool kind of gray tones, the marbled godwit, more warm, cinnamony browns, especially if they are flashing their wings. The marbled godwit is really going to flash a lot of warmer browns and cinnamon colors, and the willet really flashes those kind of striking black and white patterns on the wing. Otherwise, it's a very unassuming little bird in terms of patterning. So it's nice to have that kind of flash as it's going. Okay. Whew, we did it, and I didn't lose my voice. Okay, so the birds we covered today, we had two lookalikes in the Marsh Wren and Sedge Wren, And the Marsh Wren has that variable gurgling rattle. And again, as someone pointed out to me last year, I'd said it sounds like Alvin and the Chipmunks or speed it or fast forwarding through a cassette tape. So let's listen to the Marsh Wren. So variable gurgling rattle, and the Sedge Wren with those intro notes and more of a harsh sewing machine rattle. The common yellowthroat does the witchety, witchety, witchety. And the northern harrier, mostly silent, but does sound like this sometimes. And our two very common, our two look-alike terns, the common tern and the Forster's tern. The common does the two-parted keer call. And the Forster's tern has a monosyllabic keer call. And the Willet and the marbled Godwit, both of them namesayers. The Willet goes, Willet, Willet, piddle will Willet. And the shorter Willet. And last but not least, the marbled Godwit saying a bit of a Godwit, Godwit. And that's all we have for the evening. We made it through it. Hopefully those terns weren't too confusing. But again, I just want to stress that you can't always tell the identity of a bird that runs, that flies past your line of vision. So don't worry about it if you can't tell. There's plenty that I have to just write down as, yeah, it was one of those two terns. I can't tell the difference because I just didn't get a good enough look. They're fast flying, they're fast moving, and sometimes, they're just far enough away that you can't really tell. And that's okay. We have to learn to let some of those things go because, yeah, they're they're a good exercise in that sort of willingness to just let things go because you just have to sometimes. You can say, "Oh, I caught one or two of them in that group that looked like commons," and I guess they're probably mostly common terns, especially if you're in an area where you get the two species. But they're tough, and if you're frustrated with them, it's okay to just call them terns. Even, the non-birder people in your life will be like, wow, that's still impressive. So just give yourself a bit of grace when it comes to the more challenging species. And some of these things, it can take years before your brain finally, catches some of those things. And there's some things that you just need to look up every year. You can remember that, okay, I'm supposed to look at the wings, and if the wing color matches the back color on the top, and it's okay to just have that in your head and then have to go look at your field guide to figure out which one was which, because that's what I have to do a lot of the time. I think I finally got it with the common continuous and the Forester's fade, which I think we came to that conclusion last year or the year before during these webinars. So just goes to show you that sometimes those things they're tough to do and it's okay. Especially, if you're doing this as a hobby, like you're doing great. This is no problem. If you ever want to get in touch, here's my email address, llatchmoy@birdscanada.org. There are other quizzes and things up on the Prairie Canada MarshWatch page, so you can go and check those out. I also post the videos there, but they also go up on the YouTube channel as well. You can find Birds Canada on a variety of the social platforms if you're into that sort of thing. And we're also a charitable not-for-profit. So, if you do give charitably, keep us in mind as a place that you might like to support. But if you don't, that's okay. We're happy to have you here anyway. A big thank you to the financial supporters of the MarshWatch program in the prairies. That's Manitoba Habitat Conservancy, the Government of Canada, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, SaskPower, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. So thank you all so much for attending. This was a good one. I'm always a bit nervous because the turns are tough. So I'm glad we got through them. Okay, I will shut off the recording